All right, today we're diving into a massive Supreme Court case. We're talking about the president versus a bunch of states in a fight over who controls the economy. And believe it or not, it all might come down to the meaning of a single word in an old law, a word that could be worth trillions.
So, let's just get right to the heart of it. The fundamental question that kicks this whole thing off is, when it comes to taxing goods coming into the country, who's actually in charge?
You've got two very different answers here. On one side, you have the U.S. Constitution, and it seems pretty black and white. It says Congress has the power to tax, period. But on the other side, the president is claiming the sweeping authority to do it himself using special emergency powers, and that is the core conflict we're looking at.
To really get our heads around this, we're going to break it all down. We'll look at the constitutional question, the law itself, the one-word debate at the center of it all, a big legal idea called the Major Questions Doctrine, some other arguments the states are making, and finally, why this whole thing matters so much.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. We're rewinding all the way back to the Constitution's original blueprint for who controls the nation's money.
The states that are suing the president, they start their entire argument right here. They're pointing directly at the Constitution and saying, look, the founders gave this power to Congress for a reason. It was a deliberate choice to put the power of the purse in the hands of the legislative branch, not one person in the executive branch.
So you're probably thinking, if the Constitution gives Congress the taxing power, how can the president even claim he has the authority to slap on these huge tariffs? What law is he pointing to?
Well, it all comes down to this one law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA for short. It's from 1977, and it's designed to give the president some pretty serious powers during a national emergency. But the key, the word that this entire case hangs on, is right there in the middle: regulate.
And this is where it gets kind of wild. It really shows you how a massive legal showdown, with trillions of dollars hanging in the balance, can all boil down to what one single simple word actually means.
So here it is, the multi-trillion-dollar question that the Supreme Court has to figure out. Does the power to regulate imports also give you the power to tax them? The president's team says, yep, absolutely. But the states are saying, whoa, not so fast. Those are two very different things.
Now, this is the core challenge from the states, and it's a powerful one. They're basically saying, show us the proof. They argue that they searched the entire library of U.S. law, the whole U.S. code, and could not find a single other instance where the word regulate was used to grant the power to tax. Not one.
Now, the president's side does have a response. They point back to this old law from 1962 that used the phrase adjust the imports, and a court did say that could include tariffs. But the states say, come on, that's comparing apples and oranges. They argue that law was totally different. It used the word adjust, not regulate. It also specifically mentioned the word duty. And maybe, most importantly, everyone knew Congress meant to allow tariffs back then. With IEEPA, they argue, none of that is true.
Okay, so let's pivot to a really important legal idea the Supreme Court has been using a lot lately. It's kind of like a big picture rule, and it adds another layer to the state's case.
But first, let's just pause and appreciate the sheer scale of what we're talking about here. This isn't some small potatoes issue. We're talking about the power to tax $4 trillion worth of goods coming into the U.S. every year. That's a huge piece of the entire American economy.
And that huge number leads us right to the Major Questions Doctrine. You can think of it like this. The Supreme Court is saying that if Congress wants to give a president or a federal agency the power to make a decision of vast economic and political significance, like taxing $4 trillion in trade, it has to be super, super clear about it. You can't just hide that kind of massive power in a vague, everyday word.
The states use this fantastic metaphor in their legal briefs. They're basically saying that the president is trying to build this gigantic skyscraper of power, the authority to tax the global economy all by himself. But the foundation he's building it on is as flimsy as a wafer-thin reed. Just that one little word, regulate.
So, putting aside that whole huge debate over the word regulate, the states also have some other more targeted attacks on these tariffs. Think of them as their backup arguments. Okay, first up are the tariffs that were aimed at fixing trade deficits. Here, the states have two main beefs. First, they say Congress already created a specific law for this, the Trade Act of 1974, and it puts clear limits on the president. Tariffs can't be more than 15% and can only last 150 days. They argue the president can't just use IEEPA as a workaround to ignore those rules. But second, they challenge the emergency itself. IEEPA requires an unusual and extraordinary threat. The president, however, called the trade deficits persistent
And, as the states point out, persistent is pretty much the exact opposite of unusual.
Then you have the tariffs that are supposed to fight drug trafficking. For these, the states zoom in on a different part of the EPA law. It says the president's action has to deal with the emergency threat. So the states are asking a pretty simple question. How does putting a new tax on almost everything coming from Mexico, Canada, and China, we're talking cars, avocados, you name it, how does that directly deal with the crime of fentanyl smuggling?
The states make their point with this incredibly blunt example. It's a way of saying the connection between the solution, taxing all this random stuff, and the problem is just, well, it's not there. It's too indirect, too broad, to meet the requirement of the law.
So after all this legal back and forth, all this talk about statutes and doctrines, what's the bottom line? Why should you and I actually care about how this thing turns out?
Well, this case is about way more than just these specific tariffs. First, it's about the balance of power. A win for the president could fundamentally shift economic control from the 535 members of Congress to one person in the White House. Second, it's about our economy. It really determines if any president can, on their own, decide to impose huge taxes that affect trillions of dollars in trade. And finally, and this might be the biggest one, this ruling is going to set a massive precedent for every single president from here on out, defining just how far their emergency powers can go.
Ultimately, this whole giant, complicated case boils down to one profound question about language and power. How much authority should a president be able to pull from a single word in a law that's almost 50 years old? The Supreme Court's answer is going to be heard for a very, very long time.